Welcome to Psycho Killer. I'm Simon Ford, and I'm joined by my fellow journalist and true crime addict, Pip Watts.
And I'm Jack Morrell, a former homicide detective turned author. During 30 years in the police service, I came across a few ways of disposing of bodies. Some were ingenious, all were despicable, and none was quite as grisly as that employed by the psycho killer in this podcast. We're turning back the clock with a trip to Victorian Britain and a crime that appalled the citizens of Norwich in Norfolk.
Let's climb aboard the Psycho Killer time machine and head to the dark side.
Norwich prides itself on being a fine city. It rivalled London in size and wealth during the Middle Ages, and in the 19th century, the capital of East Anglia was a flourishing commercial centre. Norwich was quintessentially English, but as an inland port, it traded mostly with the Netherlands. Goods flowed up and down the River Wensum on sailing barges called wherries. All that money made Norwich a cradle of banking, and among other things, a centre of high fashion. A land of opportunity that tempted an enterprising young tailor away from the crowded streets of London to seek his fortune.
William Sheward was born in either Greenwich or Walworth in 1794. He started out as a pawnbroker's assistant and learnt the tailoring trade to better himself. As a boy, he heard stories about the drama and sacrifice of the Napoleonic Wars. Admiral Lord Nelson hailed from Norfolk, the romance of the tragic hero of Trafalgar, the Count's flourishing trade with the continent, and a ready market for his tailoring skills. Maybe they were what tempted young William away from the capital, but it could equally have been a baser, more sinister motive.
On the 28th of October 1836, Sheward married Martha Francis, a woman 14 years his senior. It was, by the standards of the day, a curious relationship from the start. The couple met in the Walworth district of London when Sheward hired Martha as his housekeeper. Martha Francis was originally from Norfolk. Some commentators believe she became homesick, and so, after 2 years of marriage, the couple upped sticks and moved from London to Wyndham, a market town just south of Norwich and Martha's birthplace.
The couple moved in with Martha's twin sister Mary. Contemporary accounts describe William as a quiet, inoffensive man, but possessed of a restless spirit. It wasn't long before he and Martha travelled up the road to Norwich. William found work easily, entering the employment of a gentleman's tailor on Burr Street. He was working for the same employer in 1842, but by then his restless spirit had started nagging at him. It was the beginning of both his and Martha's downfall.
William Sheward struck out on his own in business. He opened a tailor's shop on White Lion Street, but he couldn't have picked a worse time. In 1837, the English economy slumped. Historians would call the following decade the English Depression. The fine gentlemen of Norwich stopped buying expensive clothes. Their wardrobes were dictated by their shrinking disposable incomes. They had to cut their cloth accordingly. Indeed, that's where the expression for economising comes from. Then came the Panic of 1847. Government intervention in the financial sector restricted lending. There was a banking crisis. Loans were called in. William Sheward's creditors were soon banging on his door. By 1849, he was bankrupt. He took a job in a pawnbroker's shop. Humiliated and with his marriage on the rocks, William started drinking heavily.
That's a familiar pattern of events in my experience. Money problems put a relationship under pressure. One or both parties turn to alcohol or drugs to make themselves feel better. The mounting pressure becomes intolerable. People in those relationships are dropped into a meat grinder.
William Sheward had money, £400, worth more than £13,000 today, which he entrusted to his employer, Mr. Christie, the pawnbroker, in 1850. Whether the money was his in the first place is moot, because William's motive, it seems, was twofold: to keep the cash out of his creditors' reach and to stop his wife getting to it. Because, as it emerged later, William had an eye for the ladies, and he was possibly keeping the cash as a nest egg so he could start a life with a younger woman.
Trading Martha in for a younger model, so to speak. Now, a red light just started flashing against one of the characteristics of the hare-psychopathy-checklist, namely promiscuous sexual behaviour.
For sure, and a couple of others could join it, in my view. We've got an excess need for stimulation and proneness to boredom.
That restless spirit.
Followed closely by a grandiose sense of self-worth.
Striking out in business when there was clear evidence that the economy was in trouble?
Well, maybe not as clear in the mid-19th century as it would be nowadays. But yes, I suppose that could be part of it. I bet William Sheward also displayed that superficial charm when trying to impress those younger women.
And I wonder if his marriage to Martha may have been parasitic. You know, marrying an older woman because she had some savings or property. Maybe he was the sole beneficiary, and with Martha being older, William calculated she would die first.
Oh, I think he was calculating, all right. Very calculating.
Having been plunged into poverty, William and Martha went to live in Tabernacle Street, a slum neighbourhood between the River Wensum and Norwich Cathedral. They cleared the slums years ago, and the area is now called Bishopgate. It's home to, among other things, Norwich's modern magistrates and Crown Courts. At the eastern end of Bishopgate is a medieval bridge over the Wensum. Just make a mental note of that, would you?
We've got a good idea of what conditions were probably like in Tabernacle Street. 19th century social reformers William Wilberforce, Joseph Rowntree and Thomas Bernardo left comprehensive accounts of extended families living in a single room infested with vermin, rife with physical and mental illness, with widespread alcoholism and abuse. Tabernacle Street's reeking drains emptied conveniently into the Wensum, while children played in the gutters.
The Shewards were well known for their blazing arguments, bellowing, raging and shrieking at each other at all hours of the day and night. The few pieces of crockery and sticks of furniture they'd taken with them became missiles during their fights.
And so it was to the neighbours' relief that on the morning of Sunday the 15th of June 1851, one such argument ended as abruptly as it had started. Minutes later, Sheward was seen leaving the house on Tabernacle Street on his way to work at Christie's pawnbrokers. Anyone noticing a little blood on his shirt collar or cuffs might have surmised he'd cut himself shaving. Little did they know.
It was a week later, on Midsummer's Day, and Charles Johnson, a local wood dealer, was walking his dog on Martineau Lane, between Trouse and Lakenham. Nowadays, Martineau Lane forms part of the Norwich Ring Road, but in the old Queen's day, it ran through fields and woodland on the outskirts of the city. Mr. Johnson's dog came bounding excitedly out of the cow parsley with something in its mouth. At first, Johnson thought it was an animal bone. Then, the 34-year-old recoiled. It was part of a human hand.
Before long, 2 fingers and a thumb turned up a couple of 100 yards along Martineau Lane. Then somebody found a foot. The next day, Sunday, a piece of what looked like a human pelvis was found by another dog walker. Soon reports were coming in from all over Norwich. In the next 5 days, a series of grisly discoveries yielded a collection of human remains. Some were found in the vicinity of Tabernacle Street. But the main horror was that pieces appeared in locations that had already been searched. They hadn't been overlooked. Whoever was scattering the remains was going back to leave more. Moreover, while the first body parts were mainly bone and sinew, the later discoveries were, well, fleshier. The last piece to be found was delivered to Sergeant Edward Peck of the Norwich Police on Wednesday, the 2nd of July.
Now, in 1851, a professional police service was only emerging from the system of constables and night watchmen that had had its roots in the reign of Charles II. Sir Robert Peel, the Home Secretary, established the Metropolitan Police in London in 1829, but the picture in other towns and counties was a mixed bag. In the summer of 1851, there were around 13,000 police officers in England and Wales. Although the law still didn't require local authorities to establish local forces, Norwich was lucky in that it had one of the first county police forces, established in 1839 under the County Police Act. The Act was optional, and constabularies were only established in 25 out of the 55 counties.
There was no such thing as forensic science as we know it today, so faced with an array of remains and the challenge of preserving them, Sergeant Peck made an intelligent decision. He called in 2 doctors to reassemble the mutilated parts into something resembling a whole body. Dr. Darmel and the surgeon William Nichols did what they could, but it was nigh on impossible. The county police published their conclusion on posters that went up in Norwich and the surrounding countryside.
Supposed murder. Several parts of a human body belonging to a person supposed to have been recently murdered and to be that of a young female between the ages of 16 and 26 years, having been within the last few days found within the environs of Norwich. Information is requested to be given to the Chief Constable at the police office, Guildhall, Norwich, of all females who may have been recently missing, together with any particulars which may lead to the detecting of the person or persons who committed the supposed murder. The portions of the body already found comprise the right hand and foot and several bones, with numerous pieces of skin and flesh. Further search is being made for the head and remaining parts of the body.
The posters were signed H. Woodcock, Mayor.
Days passed, then weeks. The police received no concrete leads. The big mistake was the age. Martha was 54, not a young woman as described on the poster. There was even a rumour the whole thing was a prank by medical students. People had moved on. They were soon gossiping about another murder up the road in Hokum. Back in Tabernacle Street, William told anyone who was interested that his wife had left him and gone away to join an old flame in New Zealand. Nobody was surprised at that. He was a tyrant. He'd made Martha's life a misery. Good luck to her.
Faced with a cold case, Sergeant Peck again showed remarkable foresight. He preserved the evidence as best he could by pickling the severed hand, foot and other remains in spirits of wine to be kept under lock and key at the Guildhall. Time passed. Martha's twin sister Mary died, and with her any memory she had of William Sheward and the coercive control he'd exercised over her twin. William set up his own pawnbrokers, but he went bust again in 1853. He quit Tabernacle Street and hit the bottle, moving from lodging house to lodging house, surrounded by a coterie of desperate, destitute, alcoholic women.
One of them, Charlotte Buck, bore him 2 children in 1856 and 1859, but William continued having multiple affairs. Eventually, the couple married in 1862, 11 years after he murdered his first wife. By 1868, William's occupation was licensed victualler. He was the landlord of the Key and Castle Tavern in Norwich, and described by those who knew him as anxious and guilt-ridden. Struggling with rheumatism, William must have seemed a bent old man with nothing left to live for. That's certainly how William saw it.
In December 1868, William returned to London to visit relatives for Christmas. At least, that's what he told Charlotte and the children. Instead, he went back to the places where he'd wooed Martha as a sprightly young man of 24, like the house in Walworth where they'd first met. Racked with remorse, he made his way down to the steamboat terminal at Chelsea, turning over and over in his pocket the straight razor he intended using to end his misery. But William couldn't go through with it. In the early hours of New Year's Day 1869, he walked into a police station and gave himself up.
Records don't show the temperament of Inspector Davis of the Metropolitan Police, but it's safe to assume he was a reserved kind of fellow, hard to unsettle, made of sterner stuff. While others were out celebrating the new year, here was a man, apparently stone-cold sober, admitting to uxoricide. Inspector Davis seems to have taken the matter in his stride. He recalled the interview of William Sheward at the trial in Norwich. I was on duty at Walworth Station on January the 1st. The prisoner came to me and said, "I want to speak to you. I have a charge to make against myself." I said, "What is it? Explain yourself." He hesitated and then said, "For the wilful murder of my first wife at Norwich." I said, "Have you given due consideration to the very serious nature of the charge?" He said, I have kept it for years, but can keep it no longer. I left home on December the 29th, intending to destroy my life with the razor I have in my pocket." I asked him for the razor. He gave it to me. He then said, "I have been to Chelsea by the steamboat, intending to destroy my life, but the Almighty would not let me do it." He began to sob and spoke in broken sentences and at intervals. I said, "Let us hope it will all turn out a delusion." He said, "You can take my charge in writing." I did so from his dictation, and he signed it. I, William Sheward of Norwich, charge myself with the wilful murder of my first wife. Signed, W.S. He was then placed in one of the cells at the station. He was in a very distressed state of mind, but was quite sober and knew what he was saying.
2 days later, William Sheward tried to retract the confession, but by then wheels were in motion. He was taken by train from London to Norwich, where a crowd of 2,000 was waiting to catch a glimpse of him. The police loaded him into a shuttered carriage and drove him to the city jail at Norwich Castle to await trial at the Norwich Assizes. It's worth, at this point, mentioning Norwich Castle, the impenetrable cube of medieval masonry which dominates the warren of streets surrounding it. William Sheward had worked in the shadow of those limestone walls for most of his adult life. It was the backdrop to his successes and failures. Now, it swallowed him. After nearly 20 years, it was to be the stage for the final scenes in his life.
We'd be wrong to assume that a conviction was a foregone conclusion. The prosecution was in a tricky situation. They had the prisoner's signed confession and some preserved human remains, but no evidence connecting them. Many of the witnesses had died or had imperfect recollections of Martha Sheward and her husband. Charles Johnson, whose dog found the severed hand that midsummer's morning, told the court what he knew, which in the context of the case was purely circumstantial.
It appears that William Sheward had a change of heart. Probably realising he was facing the gallows, on the second day he changed his plea to not guilty. His barrister, Mr. Metcalfe QC, told the court his client was delusional when he confessed, but it was too late. The jury was out for 3/4 of an hour. Their verdict? Guilty. The judge, Mr. Baron Piggott, sentenced Sheward to death by hanging. The prisoner had nothing to say.
In the days before his execution, William Sheward wrote a full and frank account of the events of Sunday, the 15th of July, 1851. The fatal argument was about the box of money William had entrusted to his employer, Christie, 2 years before. In 1850 and 51, William had taken £150 from the box, so there was only £100 left of the original £400. Martha wanted the money back. In all probability, it was hers to start with, her life savings perhaps, or money left to her, but in Victorian England, a woman's property passed to her husband upon marriage. Did William marry Martha for her money in the first place? Well, we'll never know. That Sunday morning, William was due to catch the train to Great Yarmouth with a £1,000 loan for the captain of a fishing trawler. Now that's about £146,000 today. Martha announced that since Christie was open on a Sunday, she intended asking him for the money in the box while William was away in Yarmouth. William, who was shaving, wheeled round from the washstand and slashed Martha's throat from ear to ear with his razor. As his wife bled out on their bedroom floor, William composed himself and set out for Christie's. That night, he slept on the sofa, perhaps in denial about what he'd done and unsure about what to do next. But it was midsummer, and not to put too fine a point on it, time and flies wait for no man. Removing Martha's body under the noses of the neighbours would be impossible. So William decided to take her out, piece by piece. The surgeons who examined the remains concluded that whoever cut them up had no medical knowledge and mediocre butchery skills. In short, William hacked his wife's body to bits. We can only guess at the scene in the bedroom of 7 Tabernacle Street in the 3rd week of July 1851. Martha's blood would have saturated the rug and the floorboards. It would have soaked into the bedding.
Calliphoridae are those shimmering green blowflies that are attracted to a corpse very soon after death. They would have arrived minutes after Martha's blood was spilt and would have laid their eggs in the wound or anywhere else they could get into. Insects are cold-blooded, so their development is extremely temperature dependent. Their metabolic rate increases with increasing temperature, which results in a faster rate of development. Now it was summer, and William probably kept those windows shut.
He mutilated and disposed of the hands and feet first, perhaps to prevent identification. In this, he was successful. William decided to boil the head. It was never found, and William never said how he disposed of it. But, in all likelihood, it left 7 Tabernacle Street in a bucket to be tipped into the River Wensum from that picturesque medieval bridge we mentioned earlier. The boiling continued until William was worried the neighbours would complain about the smell, which was saying something in a slum neighbourhood like Tabernacle Street, but eventually, over a period of weeks, Martha's body was cut up and disposed of at various locations in and around the city of Norwich.
It wasn't unusual to see someone in Victorian times carrying a parcel of meat or a pail of slops to feed to a pig. But William failed to divulge exactly how he transported a human body in pieces without anybody noticing. Now, Victorian gentlemen were known to hide things under their top hats, one possible origin of the idiom for keeping a secret. But surely William Sheward didn't do that. Or did he? Once he'd covered his tracks, William kept his head down and moved out of 7 Tabernacle Street. If it wasn't for his conscience getting the better of him, the case might have never been solved.
Immediately after the trial, anonymous letters were published in the London newspapers asserting William's innocence. Similar letters were addressed to the magistrate's clerk at Norwich, and one actually claimed to be from Mrs. Sheward herself. Efforts were made to get the death sentence commuted. on grounds of the long interval between the murder and the trial. It was to no avail. On the 20th of April 1869, within the walls of Norwich Castle, William Sheward went to the gallows. The hangman, William Calcraft, was renowned for using short drops, but the prisoner didn't strangle. Observers reported his struggles were slight and brief. A crowd of 2,000 gathered outside, the same number as had seen him arrive in the city by train a few short months before, and the black flag was raised over the castle keep. It fluttered in the spring breeze, a stone's throw from where Sheward had opened his business on White Lion Street. His body was buried in a convict cemetery that's now part of Norwich's Roman Catholic Cathedral. Martha's pathetic remains were interred under the Guildhall without any sort of ceremony. It was 2019 before the place was finally given a Christian blessing.
I don't think there's a doubt in any of our minds that William Sheward was a psychopath. He exercised coercive control over Martha, if not from the start of their relationship, then very soon afterwards. This controlling behaviour is designed to make a person dependent by isolating them from support, exploiting them, depriving them of independence, and regulating their everyday behaviour.
I question whether Martha really was longing to go back to her rural roots. I think it's more likely Sheward wanted to remove her from her friends and support network in London. They weren't in Wyndham for long before he moved her out of Mary's home to new lodgings in Norwich either. Was his motive economic or more sinister?
There's no doubt in my mind that William controlled his wife's finances by denying her access to the box of money, instead entrusting it to his employer, Mr. Christie. When Martha announced her intention to retrieve it, which would have involved her discovering William had spent most of it, she paid with her life.
Exactly. But we've reached this conclusion by looking at the case through a 21st century lens. William's behaviour was extreme, but not especially different from any other Victorian patriarch. Despite being ruled by a female monarch, British women had no rights to speak of.
Once a woman married, control of any property she owned, as well as any income she received from it, passed to her husband. Although he couldn't dispose of it without her consent, her personal property, such as money from earnings or investments, and personal belongings like jewellery, passed absolutely into his control. She could not part with them without his say-so. Some progress was made in 1870 when the Married Woman's Property Act came into effect. This allowed women to keep earnings or property acquired after marriage. It wasn't until a further act in 1882 that they were allowed to retain what they owned at the time of marriage.
From 1857, divorce was made easier than it had been in preceding years. A moderately wealthy man could divorce his wife on the simple grounds of her adultery. This was based on the idea that it threatened his ability to pass his property to his male heirs. He could also claim damages against the adulterous third party.
But in this patriarchal society, the law was skewed in favour of men. A woman who wanted to divorce her husband had to prove adultery and show it had been aggravated by desertion for 2 years. Alternatively, she needed to prove her husband's cruelty, rape, sodomy, incest or bigamy, and she wasn't allowed to claim damages from the other party. This difference wasn't rectified until 1923.
On the positive side, however, the 1857 Act denied the husband any right to the earnings of the wife he'd deserted. This meant a divorced woman went back to the same property rights as a single woman. As for the right to vote, well, British women didn't get the same rights as men until the Equal Franchise Act of 1928, 77 years after Martha was murdered by her psycho of a husband.
Even so, Victorian women were never more than a few short steps away from the streets or the workhouse. This is why so many were forced to turn to prostitution to survive. And this is what created an environment where Jack the Ripper could murder vulnerable women with impunity. Today, domestic abuse is a massive international social issue, and with the pandemic making it harder for abused women to escape controlling and violent partners, the fear is that more women will die like Martha Sheward. That's why we've put the details of organisations you can contact on our website if you're concerned about any of the issues raised in this podcast. The address is psycho-killer.co.
It's also where we post exclusive content, including videos and articles by the team. But for now, it's goodbye from the three of us. We'll see you again soon on the dark side for another Psycho Killer shocking true crime story.